Discretionary listener participation is advised for the following pro wrestling podcast.
I never knew love before, and then came the Stick to Wrestling podcast. I want to thank Dionne Warwick for penning that song about her favorite podcast so long ago. I am John McAdam. Welcome to Stick to Wrestling, where if you give us 60 minutes, perhaps indeed, we will give you a rawbone podcast. This is the only wicked good podcast out there. It is the People's Podcast. It is the Major League of Professional Wrestling Podcasts. Before we get rolling, I want to encourage everyone to follow me on Twitter. Just search John McAdam and follow the guy who has guys fighting with chairs in his avatar. If you have not already, there is no better time than to join the Stick to Wrestling Facebook group, because just last night, I'm recording this on Thursday the 25th. Happy birthday, Ric Flair. I got massively sick, sickest I've ever been since 2008, and I'm staying away from everyone, obviously. It's not COVID. It's not anything that serious. It's just a really bad stomach bug. But I was up all night, and anytime I had a little bit of energy, I posted old school results. So the board is flooding with results that you can talk about, learn about, the whole 9 yards. With that, I have been looking forward to doing the show for a long time with Jammie Ward, and it's the first of 2 episodes. I thought they both came out really good. We revisited the year-end awards for the year of 1980. Let's roll. We are going to be doing the 1980 year-end awards retroactively, obviously. We're going to start by one, and it's going to be a combination of like Wrestling Observer criteria and Pro Wrestling Illustrated criteria. So here we go. This is a Wrestling Observer only one. Most underrated wrestler of 1980. This is basically a guy who should have gotten a way bigger push but didn't. Jammie, who's your candidate?
Well, my candidate is the Iron Sheik.
Okay, I can see that. Give me your rationale.
Well, when he was in WWF in '79, he got a shot at back on an MSG by winning a Battle Royal. But
yes.
Starting in 1980, up in Canada and Mid-Atlantic, and he started working a few other territories, he wasn't getting the main event push, but he was slowly working his way up to the semi-main event, I would say. And He even had a couple token championships.
Yeah, he did get that Madison Square Garden shot. It took place on June 4th, 1979. And you're right, they basically just didn't have enough confidence in him to, say, okay, Bob Backlund versus the Hussein Arab at that point is the main event. But that was one of Backlund's best Madison Square Garden matches.
Oh, yeah, I agree completely.
I recommend that if you have not seen that, check it out. It might be on YouTube or something. I don't think it's on WWE Network, but go look for it. It's really good. I took most underrated as Bobby Jaggers because I saw him in Florida and he was getting a push, but Bobby Jaggers was really good at this point in his career. He was excellent in the ring. He was a good talker. He was a great heel. They pushed him, but not as hard as I thought he deserved, and they kind of took the foot off the gas towards the end, and that was really Jaggers' last great push, and I thought it was a shame. I thought he absolutely could have come to New York, could have come to Madison Square Garden, and had a series against Bob Backlund.
Yeah, Jaggers in 1980, that's when I was getting Florida wrestling, probably the same as you on the Satellite Programming Network.
That was it, yes.
And he was getting the push at that time. Did he get the Southern title?
I think he had the Southern title for a little while, yeah, but it never came across as him being pushed as the number one bad guy. I think that was either Nikolai Volkov or Dick Slater.
Right, and they were managed by Lord Alfred Hayes, right? Volkov was, or am I a year off on that?
Actually, no. Volkov was managed by Hayes. Jaggers was originally managed by Sir Oliver Humperdinck, and then when they did the thing where Sir Oliver Humperdinck had to be Dusty Rhodes' valet for 30 days, after that ended, Jaggers was embarrassed by, or Hayes was embarrassed by Sir Oliver Humperdinck's conduct and ordered Bobby Jaggers to turn on Sir Oliver Humperdinck. We talked about this a couple of years ago on Stick to Wrestling. It was one of the most brutal beatdowns I've ever seen on a wrestling show. It was pretty crazy.
Yeah, he beat the hell out of him.
It was like, wow, mind-blowing. Most overrated wrestler of 1980. Jamie, who do you think?
This is a personal guy who I just never got. I still don't get Pedro Morales.
Oh.
Yeah, I never got Pedro. I wasn't around for the championship run. And when he came in 1980 to the WWF, I just didn't get it. I understood he was a former world champion, but watching the TV squashes, he just didn't thrill me.
I was the exact same way. I mean, he had the currency of being a former WWF champion, although that was a really long time ago. By 1980, that was 6 years ago, and 6 years goes by fast in the wrestling business. A lot changes. Yeah, you know what? Him getting the match with Backlund against the Samoans and then winning the Intercontinental title from Patera, I can definitely see that.
Yeah, I mean, when he did win the title from Patera, at that point, I had enough of Ken Patera, so I was actually kind of behind that. But when you get into 81 and you saw Morocco coming, I was actually happy Morocco beat him.
Oh, same here. Definitely same here. Morocco was, I was a heel fan definitely by then, and Morocco was the cool heel. My most overrated, and I was talking to Jamie before the show, I mentioned that I had the guy written down, and it jumped in my head. No one was more overrated than this guy in 1980. My original pick was The Sheik, which was a good pick considering that he was burning Detroit, or the wrestling scene in Detroit. And then I thought about it, and I'm like, Vern Gagne. He won the AWA World's Heavyweight Champion in 1980 as a 50-something-year-old, and Vern felt ancient when I first started getting the magazines in 76, and here he is 4 years later giving himself a retirement gift, a run with the world title. I thought that was insane.
Yeah, when I first saw Vern in the magazines, I guess I started getting the magazines late 78, early 79. I'm thinking, why is this 70-year-old guy still wrestling?
He was older than he looked. I mean, he looked older than he was, what I was trying to say. I mean,
oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I got the, what was it, the Wrestler magazine, and it covered the 3 big super cards of the summer, I couldn't believe that Vern had beaten Bockwinkel for the belt when I read it in the magazine.
No, I could not. I did not see Vern. I never saw Vern as someone who might be able to beat Nick Bockwinkel. I kind of saw Jim Brunzell. I definitely saw Billy Robinson, who was getting older by that point. But Vern just knocked my socks off with that push. I mean, this was right up there. I mean, no, it wasn't even right up there with Fritz von Erich having a run with the American title when he was so old. This was worse. This is the world title.
Yeah. Now, John, I actually have one guy that was kind of a runner-up to Pedro. And during my research, I think Ox Baker was massively overrated in 1980.
Okay.
Now, a couple promotions actually gave him belts.
Really? Which ones?
Oh, okay. Now you're going to make me actually look. I want to say I saw it and I had it written down, and now it's gone on me. All right, we'll return to that later. But yeah, looks like Central States he gave him a belt, and
he was.
And in Texas, they gave him the American Championship.
Oh, that's right.
Where he beat, of all people, Bruiser Brody.
I remember that. Texas was pushing their big heels at one point in 1980, okay? Were
right
Ox
in the
Baker
beginning.
And Bulldog Brower.
Yes.
And I mean, no wonder that promotion at that time was considered a mid-major at best. Ox at least had a good look, but I remember the first time I saw him wrestle, it was 84 in Georgia, and I'm like, this guy can't move. It was noticeable.
Yeah. But by the time we really got to see him, he was horrible. But then again, did he do the with the Grand Wizard in 1980?
I was just about to say, I need to correct myself. He had a 3-match run in the WWF, which was not seen in all WWF markets. The New York market had instead of having interviews like Boston did, they had a third match. In Boston, after the first 2 matches, you had like 7 or 8 minutes of interviews for the upcoming Boston Garden show.
That's the way Philadelphia worked.
All right.
The interviews in the middle of the show, unlike New York, where they were sporadic.
Right, and and I like that. I like that method better.
Oh, absolutely.
Instead of just getting them all in at once. And yeah, the New York market had that third match, and Ox Baker was on 3 times, and then he was gone. We talked about that a while ago on Stick to Wrestling.
And then Davey O'Hannon and Larry Sharp were the kings of the third match.
Oh yes, and Johnny Rods and Baron McKelsa-Cluna would sometimes get a win in that spot.
And Jose Estrada, all the guys that used to do the jobs to the main event and give them a tough match, they would get the win in the third match.
I always appreciated having WOR on cable until the Weather Channel came along in January 1983 and knocked it off my local cable system. I'll never forgive the Weather Channel for that.
We didn't lose it until 85, fortunately.
All right. And look, hey, promotion of the year, and there are some real candidates. Jamie, who was your pick?
Well, my runner-up is Bill Watts of Mid-South, because that's right after he first took over, and he set that territory on fire.
Oh, yeah.
But the promotion of the year, in my mind, was still the WWF with Bruno and Zbyszko on top. It just ruled for the entire year. Or at least a solid 8 months. But then it still carried, the Zbyszko heat carried over right through December.
Yeah, Zbyszko was still in the WWF. I looked up the results because Larry came up with a story that he was blackballed from the WWF for something that happened at Shea Stadium. Well, after Shea Stadium, he was still getting main event matches at the Philadelphia Spectrum against Bob Backlund.
Right. And then I think he even went into early 81 with the title shot at the Spectrum against Pedro after Pedro had beaten Patera.
That sounds about right. I think I recall that correctly. So, yeah, I mean, I just never bought that story that's why Zbyszko was was blackballed, was never brought back, because he was still in the WWF 5 or 6 months after Shea Stadium.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. I went with promotion of the year. I mean, to me, there were 3 really good ones that I got to see a lot of. WWF had a great year. They're not my top 3, though, even though Backlund, I mean, he had a great match against Patera. He had 2 really good matches against Hulk Hogan at the Philadelphia Spectrum. So he had a good year. Plus, you had that feud. Plus, Pedro coming back. I mean, before you got tired of it, it wasn't that bad. My top 3, the runners-up are Florida and Georgia, both excellent promotions in 1980. I've seen a lot of it. I mean, the television was fantastic.
And that's the first year. I'm sorry. That's the first year that the Superstation really kicks in big time.
Yes, that's
because the cable explosion. I didn't have TBS at that point, but I do know other people that was just getting TBS in 1980. So you're absolutely correct. Georgia was on fire.
Yeah, I started getting it October 1981, and believe me, every Saturday 6:05. That's what I was doing. Promotion of the year, I went with Mid-South Wrestling. I mean, like you said, Bill Watts set it on fire with guys that I had not heard of just a year earlier. The Freebirds, Junkyard Dog. I'd heard of Paul Orndorff, but I hadn't heard of the Grappler. He just put that promotion together perfectly. And it's kind of sad because it didn't get a lot of play in the after magazines, but I mean, it was drawing huge crowds.
Oh, yeah. Plus, you like I, along with the Florida shows that were on the Satellite Program Network, you had Lars Anderson's World League Wrestling on the Satellite Program Network. And most of the time, the matches he was showing were the Mid-South matches. And just like you, that's where I got captivated by JYD, the Freebirds, DiBiase, and the Grappler. And Paul Orndorff, Terry Orndorff, it was awesome.
Terry Orndorff shout out. I mean, and Paul Orndorff was such a great heel in Mid-South. He had never been a heel before. And guys can surprise you. Ted DiBiase's the best heel I've ever seen. And, there was some doubt with Ladd and Watts whether or not that would work. Well, he hit it out of the park in 82 and 83.
Oh, yeah. And in 80, he was just returning from his WWF run.
Right. And we've talked about this. I mean, he was supposed to get a run with the NWA title in 1981. I don't know the details, but I know Ted was the one guy who kind of got screwed out of the NWA title, then the UWF title, and then the WWF title. Like, he was supposed to get runs with all those belts, and it never happened for him. All right, best on interviews. So many candidates. Jamie, who did you ultimately go with?
This is going to be a shocker because I went back to my satellite program network days. Of course, Albano, Captain Lou. There's not much more it can be said. His local interviews for the arena shows. I mean, looking back, you can tell he was drunk as a skunk. But those things were absolutely freaking riots. I mean, I was laughing at that time. And then a couple years later, when I started getting videotapes, I got a whole bunch of Pacific Northwest from 1980 and got to see Piper. So kind of reflecting back, Piper in the Northwest, while not Piper of Georgia and Mid-Atlantic, he was awesome. And Piper. then you had Michael Hayes with his first big shot there in Mid-South with the Freebirds. But my choice from the Satellite Program Network, because I look forward to these interviews every single Saturday, Randy Macho Man Savage.
Oh, wow.
From the ICW, they would have like usually one ICW match, and if they didn't, there was a Randy Savage interview like every Saturday. And I was captivated by that guy, and I followed him closely after that. I always looked for his name in the sheets when I first started getting them in 82 and 83, and any chance I got to see his name in the magazines. And then it was a must when I first started trading tapes to try to get hold of ICW stuff, just so I could see Savage wrestle and talk.
That I have not seen a lot of Savage from that era, and it's time for me to start looking for it. As a matter of fact, I think I have a few tapes of old ICW collecting dust, but I will definitely check that out.
I mean, it's just a prelude to what was to come. I mean, it was great.
Oh, Randy Savage, he was such a good wrestler. He's actually a little bit underrated on the stick.
By some, not by me.
Okay. I had Albano as my number 4. He cracked me up. And 1980 was probably his best year. And like you said, he was probably drunk as a skunk 9/10 of the time. But he would do these rambling interviews, and then he would walk off. And he was funny. And then he'd walk off still rambling, and Vince would just kind of put his head down and look into the camera and say, "Captain Lou Albano, ladies and gentlemen." And he'd kind of shake his head, and all disgusted. Roddy Piper was my number 3. I have seen his work from the Pacific Northwest. I have seen his early Mid-Atlantic work. I think he showed up there like November 1980. And this was just the beginning for Roddy Piper. He was phenomenal. My number 2, as you mentioned, Michael Hayes, who I think may have become the most underrated professional wrestler of all time. I mean, all I see on the internet nowadays is Hayes being disparaged. He was an absolutely freaking great interview in the 1980s. And we've talked about this before. He kind of stopped trying, it looked like, in 1989. But before that, he was one of the best in the business.
That guy was a heat magnet.
Yeah.
And he wasn't that bad in the ring. I mean, I always enjoyed him, even before I ever knew what work rate was or anything. I always liked Michael Hayes in the ring. And to this day, he is in my top 5 favorite wrestlers of all time.
All right, there you go. I mean, and I mean, maybe it was a time and place thing. You had to be there in the 80s to appreciate Michael Hayes, but he was phenomenal. And Jamie, were you watching TBS when he turned babyface?
Yes, I was. I had just started getting TBS. And okay. I think the very first show, yes, it was. The very first show I ever saw of TBS was him coming out, apologizing to the fans, and then which led into him and Terry Gordy with giving him the watch and the baby bonnets. And it was a great turn.
It really was. And when I first started getting TBS, I see, Michael Hayes is a babyface. And I couldn't believe it. I was stunned. I was taken aback. I thought there was no way he could ever play that role. And it's like I never learned. I didn't think Ric Flair could be a babyface either, but he was.
I mean, looking back when he first came out for that interview, now that we know what we know about professional wrestling, he came out dressed in white.
That's a really good point. I never thought of that before.
It's just like Alex Karras and Mad Bull. He was always the heel until that end cage match where he came out in the white tights and the white hat.
Oh, man, I don't think I've seen that movie since the middle of the 80s. It's been like 35 years. His name has already come up, best on interviews, and I'm strictly doing this in the year 1980, Ric Flair. I mean, the turn finally happened the year before, and Ric Flair as a babyface was amazing to the point where I question whether or not he should have ever been turned heel again, especially in the Carolinas.
Oh yeah, as a babyface, he rivaled the Hulk Hogan babyface of the mid '80s.
Yes,
in Mid Atlantic, and if they would have just kept him face, just like you said, maybe we never even see Dusty Rhodes come along in the JCP, and they might have actually stood a chance against Vince later down the line.
You know what? I disagree with that. I think Vince and the WWF, they were such a machine. They had that front office that, and Crockett was still kind of running it small time. I almost hate to say it, but I just don't think the company run by Jim Crockett had a chance against WWF. We're going to be talking a little bit more about Jim Crockett later. Announcer of the year, Jamie, who do you got?
I had 3. 2 of them were the staples, Gordon and Lance.
Yep.
But I loved Vince McMahon as a kid. It's especially when he did the Spectrum shows. And then toward the end of 1980, I got to see him do the Madison Square Garden shows. And he was the Howard Cosell of professional wrestling.
That's what they wanted him to be.
And he got a 13-year-old me, hook, line, and sinker. I loved Vince.
I thought Vince was excellent as an announcer before 1984 came along and he decided he needed to be as big a carnival barker as Mean Gene Okerlund.
Right. After 84, that Vince I didn't care for, but the Vince I grew up with, I really thought was good.
And if you haven't seen Vince, I mean, I'm sure, go to YouTube, type in like WWF 1982 or something like that, or check out a Madison Square Garden show before Hogan got there. Vince was good at his job.
Oh, yeah. In 1978 and 79, he did all the Spectrum shows. I mean, Dick Graham was there with him, but Vince was the guy doing the play-by-play.
Yeah, I do remember that. They brought in Cal Rudman for whatever reason.
Yeah, that was in 81. I guess Vince just didn't feel like coming to Philly anymore.
Okay, I was going to say, do you know what led to that?
No, I'm just guessing he didn't want to, go to Philly anymore. I mean, look, he was there for almost 10 years doing TV tapings every 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Maybe he just grew tired of going to the city.
Maybe. All right.
And you know what sucks? I lived 6 miles from the Philadelphia Arena and never knew they taped there. Thus, I never was able to ask my father to take me.
Oh, wow. I mean, how would you know? They never, on television, they never identified where they were coming from. They said, did they say the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission? I don't think
no,
they did.
They would only say sanctioned and supervised by the State Athletic Commission.
Okay.
That goes all the way up to Joe McHugh in 84 before they left Allentown.
All right. Yeah, you're right. For announcer of the issue, yours is Vince McMahon. That's right. A good one. I've got Vince at number 3, Lance Russell at number 2, and you can guess Gordon Soley is number 1. I mean, back then, Gordon was still really good, and he was not only doing Georgia, he was doing Florida. So I put all that together, and I'm like, you know what? Gordon, it's kind of Gordon, and then second place.
I can't argue that at all. I mean, Vince is just my opinion. Gordon's your opinion, and it's a damn good opinion because actually there was 2 Gordon Soley. You just said Florida and Georgia, but the Florida one was much better than the one in Georgia.
I agree.
I always thought.
I thought he called the matches better because Florida had better in-ring action, but Gordon was kind of the glue that held, well, he was the glue that held Florida together too, but he was like the glue that held that Georgia television show together, I thought, until he kind of fell off a cliff in 82.
Yeah, well, he's the only man that could have turned Piper face at that point.
And that was an amazing turn. Morocco is ready to beat up Gordon Soley. And Roddy Piper, another guy I thought would never turn babyface, comes to the rescue. It was a really good time. Rookie of the Year, this one is a tough one because I don't know when a lot of guys started. So I decided to go with what Pro Wrestling Illustrated had as their top 4. And here are the candidates. Barry Windham, who started in 1979, so close enough. Rick McGraw, who I think started in 75 or 76. We're way off on this one. Terry Taylor, who I think started in 1980 in Florida. And Tom Prichard, who I think started in 1980 in Los Angeles. I could be wrong on any of those. Jamie, I think this one's kind of an easy one. Who did you go with?
Well, I think it's that guy that I co-hosted with you about 2 years ago, where we had the show on Mr. Barry Windham.
Yes.
Yeah, Barry's a runaway with this one. I mean, you just saw the talent from day number 1, and like 7 months into 1980, he even got the TV title win over Mr. Saito.
Yeah, and I think it was 1980 that he had a match on TV. It might have been early 81. I could be off on this. He had a match on TV against Dick Murdoch, and it was supposed to be a babyface match. And I remember sitting there watching my TV saying, Barry, look out for this guy. I don't know. And yep, Murdoch turned heel.
And Barry learned a lesson.
Yes, Barry learned a valuable lesson. You be the one who turns on Dusty Rhodes, not the other way around. All right. Manager of the Year.
Can we just backtrack just quick?
Absolutely.
In my research, you're gonna hear that a lot for the next. We got about a half hour to go. Tom Prichard had a hell of a 1980.
Really? Tell me more.
He was in LaBelle's promotion out there in L.A., and the guy held the America's Tag Team title 4 different times with 2 different partners. The first time he partnered with Apollo Jalisco and won that belt twice.
I have never heard of that person.
I never heard of him either. But the next guy you have heard of.
Chris Adams.
No
way.
No, this guy will put you to sleep. Al Madrill.
Oh man, poor Al. I thought I know Chris Adams and Tom Prichard teamed up somewhere, maybe in Portland.
It's possible, but they probably teamed up there also. But according to the listing that I saw, him and Adams never won the tag team titles. Okay,
you're probably right then. I am probably confused as usual. All right. Manager of the Year, 1980. I have an idea who your pick's going to be, Jamie. Go right ahead.
Well, you probably think I'm going to say Lou Albano or the Grand Wizard of Wrestling.
I thought you were going to say Lou Albano.
Okay. I got a sleeper.
Uh-huh.
A guy who could actually be considered a breakthrough star of the year. Jimmy Hart.
Jimmy Hart. That is a good pick.
Because that's where Lawler breaks his leg. Jimmy gets the bus out, rolls over him frontwards and backwards. And then the rest of the year, that's where the first family forms.
Yes. And you could say that Jimmy Hart carried the heel side in Memphis for about 5 years. Absolutely.
And that first year was the most important one because Lawler was out all year. I mean, he returns as a face like October, November, but he missed basically that whole entire year.
Yeah, and really, I mean, I hate to say this, the only really interesting thing going on in Memphis at that time was Jimmy Hart. I mean, they tried so hard to fill Lawler's shoes, and it just wasn't happening.
Right. They had what he managed, and Jimmy Valiant before he went totally crazy. You know, Valiant was still semi-normal then, and then you had the Valiant Tommy Rich feud.
Yeah, I mean,
in that summer before Rich ends up turning heel.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, Jimmy Hart had an excellent year. He's on my list. and mine's a little bit of a curveball. I was debating between Captain Lou Albano and the guy I ultimately went with, which was Sir Oliver Humperdinck. I had never seen him before. Obviously, I'd seen him in magazines, but he was the top guy in Florida. And again, he carried the heel side. If you were in 1980, if you were a heel in Florida, before Humperdinck turned, obviously, like you were nothing if you weren't in Sir Oliver Humperdinck's army.
That's right.
So anyway, let's go most outstanding wrestler, which is an Observer Award for 1980. Who do you got, Jamie?
Thinking back, what did either of us know about work rate back then?
Not much.
Not much at all. So I'm just kind of basing it on who I thought was a really good wrestler back then, or who I might have seen on tape a year or two later that I was really impressed with. And my main three are the three world champs: Nick Bockwinkel, Harley Race, and Bob Backlund. And then I'll have to go with Harley as the most outstanding wrestler. His title defenses all over the world. Yes, it's true. He really did go all over the world.
He did.
And guys, just a short list: Dusty, Austin Idol, Tommy Rich, Wrestling 2, Manny Fernandez, Steve Kern, Giant Baba, Dick Murdoch, Dick Slater, Chavo Guerrero, The Spoiler. He wrestled everybody.
I miss those days. I miss those days of having territories and having an NWA champion that just had this long list of guys that he would defend against. And, you know, you got to remember, like in Florida, it wasn't Harley Race versus Dusty Rhodes, the top guy every time. You would get, you know, Race against Barry Windham, against Steve Kern, against Mike Graham.
Yes. And even on TV, you'd get those matches once in a while.
Once in a while, but they did have them. That's a good pick. Mine ultimately went to Ric Flair, who, again, had a dynamite 1980. And I think by this point, he was the best wrestler, if not in the world, because Fujinami at this point was phenomenal. But we're keeping it to U.S. only anyway. But I just can't think of a better in-ring performer at this time than Ric Flair. I considered Bob Backlund, and he had some really good matches in 1980. But he had such a stinker against Harley Race September 22nd, 1980, that I'm just like, okay, Flair, I have not seen Ric Flair in one of these pretty much ever.
Yeah, I was so disappointed when the first MSG show I saw on USA Network, they didn't show the match.
Yeah.
And I didn't see it really until, I guess, into the 90s before I ever saw that match. And I basically fell asleep. You're right. It was just boring.
It is available on the WWE Network if you need help falling asleep. Another guy that was really good in the ring in 1980. I've seen enough of him to feel like I can say this. He's come up on this program before. Chavo Guerrero. Like, I was really taken aback the first time I saw him in Southwest Championship Wrestling. I'm sorry he didn't have a bigger career, because he was great. Yeah,
I always thought Chavo should have done more. I mean, again, back to 1980 is when I first discovered that on a Spanish-speaking station out of Paterson, New Jersey, they had the LA shows.
Mm-hmm.
And Chavo was on those when I first started watching.
Yeah, and another guy.
Really impressed by him there. And then he actually, I forget who he wrestled at Chase Stadium. But I was really impressed when I saw him on that Shea Stadium show, because instead of back on Harley Race for that hour draw, during that hour, they showed matches from Shea Stadium, and one of them was his.
I am trying to think of who his opponent is, and I am getting frustrated. Was it Jose Estrada?
Probably. It had to be somebody like his same size. That way. It certainly wasn't Larry Sharp, that's for sure.
Nope, that was Pat Patterson, if I recall correctly. Nope, it was Patterson Kamada. I'm all over the place on this.
He got Inoki Pretty Boy Larry Sharp.
Okay. Show. Oh, man.
Why I know that, I don't know.
Because you have a good memory. All right. Let me see. Let's go to most hated wrestler of the year. And this would be best heel in the Observer. I mean, I think one guy kind of stands out this year, but let's hear what Jammie has to say.
All right. Well, I got my top three. The first one, from what I can tell, and got the tapes a couple years later, Playboy Buddy Rose.
Nice.
In the Northwest, they hated his guts. I mean, they were throwing stuff at him in the ring and everything back then.
And Buddy was a really good worker and a really good talker. I mean, and I'm not saying this to be mean, but you got to work on that physique, Buddy. You can't just fall back on a ha-ha, I'm fat gimmick.
In 1980, while he was heavy, he wasn't as heavy as he was in 90 or 81 during his WWF run, or even as time progressed. But Buddy could move.
Yeah. Even when Buddy was completely out of control at the end of his career, we're talking like Portland in 1990. I mean, he was morbidly obese. He could still wrestle. It was amazing.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right.
My number. Oh no, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say I want to hear your number two.
My number two would be guys really in their first breakout appearance. And it's not one wrestler. It's not two wrestlers. It's three wrestlers. And you know where I'm going.
Oh, yeah.
The Fabulous Freebirds.
They're my number two as well. Well, Hayes is my number two. I don't have the Freebirds, but just as good.
Okay, well, we can make Hayes the number two. But all three of them combined, when they added Buddy to the act, I think it actually improved it more because Hayes became more of the voice. And he didn't have to get in the ring all the time. And he pulled the old neck injury, and they had a tough time getting him in the ring. And after the JYD blinding angle, it was JYD Hayes that drew the 26,000 in the Superdome.
Yeah, it's always the heels that really are the ones who draw, even though Junkyard Dog certainly had a lot to do with that. But, I mean, you need a heel to really make this machine go. Right.
I mean, we'll talk about, I'm sure JYD's coming back up pretty soon. But and then my number one, being a WWF guy, it has to be Larry Zbyszko.
I mean, your one and two are my one and two. Larry Zbyszko, I mean, he's kind of crushing it in 1980.
Yes, he was. And as Barry Rose would say, you're 100% right, John McAdam.
And really, it wasn't like he just got handed this angle, which would have been good enough anyway. I mean, anytime Bruno's protege turns on him, I mean, that's a license to print money. But Larry Zbyszko was actually really good in the role. He was, his interviews were fantastic. He was resentful. He had no remorse whatsoever, and he was determined to just get rid of Bruno Sammartino.
And what a difference from the babyface Zbyszko, even the one that we saw with Tony Garea. I mean, I never saw this mean streak going to pop out in this guy.
No,
I was never a Zbyszko fan until he turned heel.
Larry could get fired up occasionally on an interview, but for the most part, he was just a white meat babyface.
Yeah, that's exactly what he was. And he wasn't even cut at that point. I mean, he had kind of a thick Buddy Rose type body going on. And then, but when he returned after losing the tag team titles, he went to Mid-Atlantic, I think, for a little bit. And then he returned back to the WWF. He was cut pretty well at that point.
Yeah, I think, and Zbyszko, to me, he came back really quickly, I thought, to do the Bruno angle. I mean, I might have waited a little while longer, but then again, Bruno is near the end of his career, and it certainly drew. I mean, every Saturday night, the WWF was drawing $100,000 at an arena with those two on top.
Yeah, they sold out the Philadelphia Spectrum, but in March for their first match, and that's the first time the Spectrum had sold out in over 2 years.
Oh, wow. And what made it good, too, is you could have Bruno with a hot program on top in one city and send Bob Backlund to another major city, and boom, now you're having $200,000 houses every Saturday night. It was, just a phenomenal time.
Yeah, and looking at the results, you're right. That's exactly what they did. They started running the split shows on the weekend, which they never really did before.
No, and they barely had the roster to do it. You would have like the top match, then you'd have like the Samoans or something as the number 2 match, and then it would be almost all prelim guys after that, and it worked.
But you would luck out in Boston. You'd get Pete Doherty against Fred Marzano. I would have died to see that match.
I used to be pals with Fred Marzino. He had a lot of cool stories. Good guy. I hope he's listening. All right. Let me see. So I had Zbyszko, Hayes. My number 3 was Dick Slater, who I thought was fantastic in Florida. You know what? Now that I think about it, I would probably go Albano over Slater, but Dick Slater was really good in 1980 and deserves a shout out.
No, definitely.
All right. Most popular wrestler of the year, or best babyface, as they say in The Observer. Jamie, share your thoughts.
Well, of course, you have the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, or you got Mr. Wrestling 2, or in the Northeast, the most popular wrestler of all time, Bruno Sammartino. But for 1980, I'm going to go where we just went. 26,000 people, Superdome, Junkyard Dog.
That's mine.
The blinding angle.
Yeah.
And where I've heard stories where people were actually sending money to JYD's house because they thought he was actually wasn't getting any income coming in. And those people just loved him. And you had the, what's the name? Ricardo Coleman?
Ricardo Coleman, yeah.
He was there for all that. And I remember hearing him on your show talk about it.
Yeah, Ricardo, I'm so jealous of Ricardo getting to grow up on Mid-South Wrestling and not missing an episode. He's my first internet buddy, as I mentioned when he was on. So, okay, so you've got JYD as number 1. I've got JYD as number 1 for obvious reasons. I mean, he was like the kick-ass babyface. Like, he was the babyface you didn't mess with. His interviews were fantastic. He had that charisma, and it was a breakout year for him. So he's my number 1 as well.
Did you ever hear, was it Watts' idea or was it Ernie Ladd's idea to push Sylvester Ritter as the Junkyard Dog?
It was Watts' idea. As a matter of fact, Ladd, if I remember the story correctly, Ladd wasn't giving him enough of a push, and Watts, I think, actually fired Ladd as booker. And, Ladd got to talk his way back in, but Watts was dead serious about pushing this guy. And he let the Grappler have it one night, too, because Grappler was not giving JYD enough offense. Like, he wanted this guy as his top star.
I agree.
Okay. And let me see. Who's your number 2?
I just got distracted for a minute. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Who's your number 2, Jamie? I think we have the same number 2.
All right. Well, my number 2 is Bruno.
Same here.
That guy selling out, in his farewell tour, just selling out everywhere. What they put, 22,000 at Shea Stadium for that show?
I think it was more than that. I think it was north. It was like 35,000.
Oh, 35,
if I recall
okay.
correctly.
And they only there's the kicker. They only promoted that in New York City. There was no promotion in Philadelphia for that at all. If I hadn't been watching WOR, I would have never known that they were having a big show.
Same here. It was never mentioned on the Boston show. I only knew about it from the WOR TV.
Yeah, that was great being a week ahead of the in Philly. It was a week ahead of the Philly TV. So I used to
2 weeks ahead of Boston.
Oh, really? Yeah. I used to tell all my friends, "Oh, you got to watch this Saturday. This is what's going to happen." How do you know? I just know. I wouldn't tell them how I knew.
I didn't start getting WOR on cable until February 1980, and I was in New York on October 18th, 1978 was the date that Peter Maivia turned on Bob Backlund. And I'm telling all my friends who watch wrestling, Maivia is a bad guy now. They're like, no, he's not going to do that. And then 2 weeks later, he turns on Backlund.
Yes, after turning on Chief Jay.
Exactly.
Backlund should have known better.
That was, let me see, the Backlund turn aired on October 18th, and then a very apprehensive Chief Jay Strongbow climbs in the ring at Madison Square Garden 2 days later on the 20th, and Maivia obviously turns on and walks back to the dressing room. And
that's right. That was the Backlund turn was first. Okay.
Yeah, and then they did that. They did that in like every city. Maivia, turns on Chief Jay Strongbow. Poor Chief Jay.
Oh, he deserved it. When you look back, he deserved it.
Who was your number 3?
Well, my number 3 is Dusty.
Dusty's my number 4.
Yeah, I still love Dusty at that time. I was watching him on Florida. I had caught Dusty in late '78 when I was first watching the WWF, and he worked 3 or 4 straight shows at the Spectrum in late '78, and he still made a couple of appearances in early '79, and then getting to see him again on Florida Wrestling. And plus, he was Dusty Rhodes.
Yeah. Yeah, Dusty was my number 4, and I was a huge fan of Dusty probably before like 85, 86, when it was just like, okay, if you're making me choose who to cheer for between Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes, I'm cheering for Ric Flair.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was great. I mean, he came up to Boston and had a main event run against superstar Billy Graham in late 77, early 78. And he just came on TV out of nowhere, and this guy had it.
And he had it almost to the end. I mean,
yeah.
his TV persona was great. Back in 86, 87, I used to tell people, I'd love Dusty Rhodes. I can't stand Virgil Runnels.
It's funny. I'm like you. I have a love-hate relationship with Dusty Rhodes, and that's pretty. You know what? You probably just summed it up best for me.
Yeah, and then I got to meet Dusty one time, and it was quite the thrill, but it was also kind of a letdown. I'd gone down to Florida in '89 for spring break, and me and my buddy went to the Dusty Homecoming show.
Oh, wow.
And we weaseled our way into the back, dropping the name Larry Sharp. So we got in the back and met everybody. We got to meet Gordon Soley. And before the show and then after the show, Gordon was just standing there smoking a heater. So we walked up and talked to him for a little bit. And he said, "Hey guys, where are you going after this?" And we're like, "I'm probably just going back to the hotel." He goes, No. You want to come to this place called, I believe it was called McDitton's in Tampa, where all the wrestlers would go back after the show. So I end up, my buddy can't get in because he's too young, but he insists that I go in anyway. So I see Gordon Soley. Gordon asked me to sit down with him. Another guy sits down with us who we had met during the show, because I think we're the only 2 people that knew who he was, Otto Vons.
Oh, wow.
So I end up sitting there drinking with Otto Vons and Gordon Soley for about an hour when Dusty comes walking over and says, "Excuse me, sir, what's your name?" And I said, "Jammie Ward." And he goes, "Look, Jammie, I'm Dusty Rhodes. I'm the American Dream. My pleasure to meet you, my friend.
Wow.
However, I need to talk to Big Otto for a few moments. So if you don't mind, I'm going to steal Otto away from you 2. I don't care. I'm still sitting there with Gordon Soley, but it was quite a thrill and a great story to tell. I love telling that one.
So Otto Vons was cool to you?
Very cool.
Wow.
Oh, yeah.
I have no idea. I've just heard like some negative Otto Vons stories.
No, well, we saw him, and I said, "Tom, is it?" And he goes, "That's Otto Vons." And we go over and we say, "Mr. Vons, it's a pleasure to meet you." And he goes, "Oh, it's nice to meet you guys too." So we talked to him for a few minutes, just normal conversation. And then, so he remembered me back at the bar. And the strange part about all the wrestlers I've met, and I've had a chance to just have like a little bit one-on-one normal conversations with, they all want to know about the post office.
I did not see that one coming. Most of the conversation
with Otto Vons and Gordon Soley, we were either talking about the United States Postal Service or we were talking about NASCAR. Otto was a NASCAR fan. Figure that one out.
How does he get it in Austria?
I have no idea, but him and Gordon were talking on the same level, and my head just spinning around. I mean, the only 2 names I knew at that point were Dale Earnhardt and Richard Petty.
I barely know anything about NASCAR, but that is a really cool story. Thanks for sharing.
Like I said, I love to tell that one. You just gave me a layup, so I had to tell it.
I told the story on the show before, but we have new listeners. I mean, I met Dusty once. I think you were there in 1980 at the Marriott in Philadelphia. And one of my friends says to me, you're not going to get your picture taken with Dusty Rhodes, which means I am absolutely getting my picture taken with Dusty Rhodes. Don't challenge 22-year-old me like that. And I walked up to him like, Dusty, I just want to say I'm a big fan. I came down from Boston to see the NWA. You're my favorite wrestler. Just thank you. And he's like, no problem. Can I get a picture with you really quick, Dusty? And he said, sure. No, I got the picture. And someone on our Facebook group was actually nice enough to, it's not a good picture, but he was nice enough to colorize it. My most popular wrestler, my number 3, barely beating out Dusty Rhodes, was Mr. Wrestling 2, who I thought did a lot of great work in Georgia. He had that great feud against the Masked Superstar. He was, again, a kick-ass babyface. He wasn't just someone who came out and talked a little slowly and kind of like he's Johnny Bench or something. Like Mr. Wrestling 2 had real fire, and I enjoyed him as a babyface. I know he has his detractors, but I am not one of them.
Yeah, I always enjoyed too, and the Georgia stuff I've seen from this time period, it was easy to get behind too.
Yeah, I agree with you. He was a great babyface. I hope you guys are having as much fun listening to that as Jamie and I had recording it. I want to thank Jamie for being on the show, doing a doubleheader. He's going to be back next week. I want to thank our producer, Lou Kipilman, for all the great work he does with Stick to Wrestling. And among other things, we're going to be talking about the top 5 wrestlers of 1980. And we're going to talk a little bit about Jim Crockett Jr.'s recent appearance on Conrad the Mortgage Guy's podcast. Jim said some things that I just didn't believe. So we'll get to that next week. I want to thank you all for listening. Have a great next 7 days. This has been a production of the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network.
This concludes our podcast day.